Hey campaigners, in historical terms, one of my favorite elections to talk about, the 1988 election between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, is often thought about as kind of a joke, a historical joke, because George H.W. Bush became a one-term president after he lost to Clinton in 1992, and Michael Dukakis' campaign is remembered not for a series of successes, but for a series of pretty terrible gaffes, two of which we'll talk about in detail in this course. But it's one of my favorite elections to talk about, both for historical purposes as well as theoretical purposes, for a few reasons. Number one, the stakes were huge. These two men, Dukakis and Bush, were trying to replace a living legend at that point, which was Ronald Reagan, and those were big shoes to fill. Number two, each of them had something going for them in the sense that Bush had a long career as vice president and then chief of the CIA before that. He was a one-time presidential contender before Reagan beat him in the primaries in the 1980 election, and he was a decorated war hero. And Michael Dukakis was a long time and very successful and very adaptable governor of a big state, the state of Massachusetts. However, neither of them was particularly adept as a campaigner. They weren't adept with negative hardball tactics, and they also weren't very good at getting voters to identify with them specifically, personally, in that kind of emotional, primordial sentiment sense that we were talking about last week. Both of them were sort of policy debaters, treating the election as if it was just a series of deductive, logical points where voters would automatically identify whose policies would better serve them and then vote for that candidate in turn. So the architect of the winning strategy against Dukakis that Bush authored was actually South Carolina's own Lee Atwater. Now, if you talk to Democrats about Lee Atwater is a kind of incredibly polarizing, to some even evil figure who employed a series of negative, hardball, some say even racial tactics against legions of Democratic opponents, and then recanted these tactics as bad for the country on his deathbed. If you talk to many Republicans about Atwater, some of them think that he was the godfather of hardball tactics, campaign tactics, some of which were taught to Karl Rove, and that he's responsible for Republican dominance in the 80s and 90s, both at the local level as well as in Congress and sometimes the presidency as well, starting with George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan. So either way, he's a polarizing figure. But what he does in 1988 that's particularly memorable for our purposes is that not only he redefines Dukakis not as a moderate governor from a large state, but as a liberal governor from a liberal state. And in so doing, he redefines not only Dukakis, but he aids in the redefinition of the word liberal in American society. Democrats had often been calling themselves liberals all through the middle portions of the 20th century, the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s. The word begins to get a negative connotation with the rise of the conservative movement in the 60s and 70s, but it's still not something that candidates especially, are running from until Lee Atwater makes it public relations poison to call yourself a liberal in 1988. And they successfully brand Dukakis as a liberal before he's able to brand himself as anything else.